So the poems that I'm going to start off with are three poems. I've been working on this book, and it's sort of a poetic autobiography. And so I picked out poems that dealt with work. And these are, I grew up in New York. I was born in 1946, which makes me, you can add it up, it's beyond, it's a high number. Growing up in New York, I grew up in Queens, and Queens was sort of at that time, an outlying area from, much different than Manhattan. And there were still people, though, that would come to the block where I grew up, with different kinds of work, you know, and they would have in a truck or a cart or something like that, and they'd go up and down the streets. And so these are three poems dealing with three of those, three different people that would come around the neighborhood. So the first one is called Charles on Wheels. And does anyone know who Don Amici is? Okay. Well, there's an allusion to Don Amici. So he was an actor. And, okay. Charles on Wheels. In late summer, before the burning of leaves in gutters, when the smell of hot tar popped into air, and nuns who ordered the other 3 seasons of our lives still slept inside ivy convent walls, and priests were seen on faraway beaches in aloha shirts and sneakers. Charles on wheels, his mustache trimmed like Don Amici's, slowly drove his black panel truck through the streets. A mobile fruit and vegetable stand, sweet peaches, apples, oranges, tomatoes, cool green heads of lettuce, all laid out in rows like a flag from a land beyond our block, where overalled farmers joined hands with their families and bowed to the American cornucopia. Charles on wheels, an envoy from a garden more fruitful than Eden, would give the children fat plums, purple teardrops of pleasure, and we would cry, "Charles, Charles, the summer is running from us. We've heard the nuns' habits stirring." And Charles would honk from the end of the block, a black sun at the end of the long last days of summer. This next one was a man who would come around, and a lot of times they would be coming in the summer, just because of the weather in New York. And this one's called The Knife Man. There was a mourning in his bell, a heavy clank of metal on metal, and in the houses a rush to gather edges dulled by the passing seasons, scissors, vegetable knives, great carving blades the children offered to the knife man, his skin stabbed taut by summer's heat, his face shadowed by the visor of a gray cap. His eyes fell back into his head like the eyes of a starving wolf stalking the deer with a worm in its heart. The knife man spoke a language rough as his knuckles skinned on the sharpening stone spun by his worn boot on wooden treadle. We didn't understand the words, but their sounds cracked our bones, settled in their marrow. One day, after he left, in the sanctuary of my mother's kitchen, I slid my thumb down a sharpened blade, opening flesh, learning the tongue of wet fire. I spoke the knife man's language. And actually, I didn't slide my thumb. I slid my left index finger across the blade, but thumb works much better than left index finger. And I have a scar still. And the last of these is a poem, sort of an homage to E.E. Cummings and Wallace Stevens. And it's called The Good Humor Man. In twilight summer hours, beneath long arms of oak or within the hive of the mulberry bush, its sour berries, sweet appetizers to summer's cold feast, we waited for the white-robed priest of dessert to drive his tabernacle of chocolate and toasted almond down our street, and we would chant, "The good humor man is coming, the good humor man is coming," and our bodies hummed as we swarmed his truck, impatient for the small white freezer doors to open and reveal the steaming honey of Dixie cup, creamsicle, and ice. When he slipped the coins we begged from our parents into the jangling change maker hanging from his belt, and chose one of us to sit in the open cab and pull the bell cord, our hearts peeled against our ribs. The air roared with laughter. This next poem, I was thinking about this, the whole idea of work, and how I think as a child and into your teenage years and whatnot, in a way you have to learn how to work. It's not something that just happens. And so I, from the summer after 7th grade to the summer after my first year in college, I had a job. My step-grandfather and his brother had started a moving company in New York City, which basically was a cart and a horse in the early 1900s. And over time, they went into piano moving. And they built a business moving pianos in New York City. And so in the 7th grade, I started to work in this business. By that time, my two uncles were running it. And it's just a poem, I think, about learning how to work and all the things that can be involved. And it's a little bit of a long poem, but it's worth it, right? So Moving Pianos for Eddie Leishman, my grandfather and founder of Leishman Brothers Piano Movers. I was the kid, the boss's nephew, the boy they sent to the bank with weekly receipts. My pockets bulged with cash, checks, and rolls of coin as I walked the Spanish Harlem streets before they became mean with junk. Past Israel's bodega, Ramos's record store, its tiny speaker wired above the door, blasting the beautiful sounds of Tito Puente, Celia Cruz, the young Willie Colon. Past the corner drugstore where a thin young man daily imagined himself Dracula, covering and uncovering his mouth with a black cape, his eyes revealing nothing. On the way back, I stopped at the hot dog cart and fell in love with the Puerto Rican girls, their eyes black as the beads of my mother's rosary, their tongue sweet as Latin. At 12, I was the office help, adding long columns of numbers in the account books till I became fast as my uncle, calculating the sums in a small place just above my heart. I could feel if I was right. I was the janitor, sweeping the concrete aisles between the pianos I couldn't lift, my arms thin, adolescent wires used to hours of basketball, but not to music's weight. In the slow afternoons in the back of the warehouse, I'd try to lift one end of a spinet, imagining myself Murphy, cigarette dangling from a corner of his mouth, laughing at insults tossed between the men. Blue outlined women writhing on his forearms as he raised the piano with a slight straightening of his bent knees, then dropped his pants to prove he had eyes tattooed on the cheeks of his ass. The next year I smoked 3 packs a day and could hold my end of a Wurlitzer. I learned how to Dutch a piano onto the truck's tailgate, throw one end onto a canvas pad, the other into the air, turn and drop it in my partner's hands, slip a wooden roller under its sliding board, crouch at the low end and push. I learned the ties to secure it to the truck, how to pad, where to place the wooden chocks to save the legs, how to take it upstairs, around corners, through doorways made for the thin. I learned how to carry a baby grand, an organ, an 8-foot Steinway concert into houses where Big Henny said, the only thing they know how to play is the fucking radio. And I learned about the men, Butch, the shop steward, who did everything by the book and always wore a spotless uniform of heavy cotton shirt and pants and read the racing forms between stops. Preacher, who had a storefront church in Harlem and would caution me that the men's harsh words about one uncle were nothing, but they were the truth. Russell, whose solemn strength stopped the racist jokes. He was shot, resting on a stoop one Friday evening for his weekly pay. Benny, who lived in his unpaid-for Cadillac and always offered to balance the keyboard when there was an upright to hump 4 stories. Murphy, who lived on the edge, whose back was a tattooed map of Navy ports and his face the path of coming disasters, who sang and played an old upright as it slid from the back of the truck into traffic. And I learned about my uncles, the bosses, Howard, the career military man, squeezed out when they decided they wanted the degree to lead the uneducated into slaughter. His motto, there was always work, and if there wasn't, he would make some. Moving stacks of pianos from one side of the warehouse to the other in the heat, which covered us like dusty burlap. And George, my uncle of the big heart, the one they'd asked for in advance, a day off, some time to get things straight, who'd buy beers on hot Friday afternoons and send the men home early, whose heart burst from too much smoke and food and sweet times. I learned how the day could break a man with its labor, turn on him like a dog slipping back into wildness, how fragile the back and bone, hand and shoulder, how the strength of the whole can bring down each part. I learned how to be the weight I carried, to move like the masters. I learned the art of work. So I did that, as I said, through the end of my freshman year in college. Then I had 2 years as a bartender in the summers. And then I graduated from college and went right to graduate school to become a teacher. And so I went to a summer session, and they basically showed you how to be a teacher, you know, like in 4 easy lessons. And then they put you in a school in September, and off you went. And so I was teaching in Roxbury, Massachusetts, and this is about 1967. So this is called student teaching. They gave my master teacher a new job. They gave me her 2 classes, 7th and 8th grade language arts, 50 students on my own. In time I learned to have 2 lesson plans, one in plain view, the required curriculum, one hid for teaching the writers I was learning to read, Langston Hughes, Gwendolyn Brooks, Richard Wright. Once a month, a supervisor from downtown evaluated my teaching. Your tie was pulled down, your top shirt button open, the window shades were not all at the same level. When Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, they locked the school down. I asked to bring a neighborhood group to talk with the students. They said, not here, in the park, across the street, once. At the end of my year, my supervisor told me, don't bother to apply for a job in this city. And this one is also a teaching poem. After I had moved to Oregon, I worked at the University of Oregon doing what was called the HEP program for children of migrant farm workers. And then I moved to Lane Community College and taught there for, I think, 30 years. Again, working with students coming back from work, had been working for many years in the lumber industry and so forth, and coming back to school because of economic reasons, working with refugees from Vietnam, students from Mexico, the most wonderful students. I had not the students that are being described falsely right now. Anyhow, this is called learning to paint. You're thinking, wait, how does that work? In basic English, my students fight nouns, verbs, the structure of a sentence. A 40-year-old woman who can bead intricate ancestral designs is near tears. A 30-year-old man who's lost his job, who knows the grammar of machines, shrugs and holds his head. I tell them my story of learning to paint, how I hate my teacher's ease with the brush, how her trees look like trees, her bamboo like eloquent characters on a Chinese scroll, how in my hand the brush is a cat, going its own way, imperious in its disdain. I try to think how Lao Tzu thinks, bend like the willow to my frustration. But my willow looks like that cat, and I want to smash the ink against the wall and shout, "That is art!" We laugh, our heads nodding like leaves in a slow black drip of rain. Moving to Oregon was somewhat of a shock after living and growing up in New York City, as you can imagine. And I was lucky enough to get into the MFA program in Oregon and to have Ralph Salisbury as my mentor. And Ralph, in our reading classes, he would say, you should read some work by indigenous writers, and because I had read, I went to Jesuit schools for 8 years, so I knew read all the classics. I studied Latin, Greek, the whole deal. But I had no idea of this other world of literature and this other world of sentient beings that we live with. And so these are just a couple of poems of my kind of efforts to begin to understand those types of things. So the first one is called Climbing Mount Pisgah. It takes time to learn to walk this way, to match breath to step, step to slope. At the top, back against rock, solitary soul drifts in, out of sleep. Bamboo flute leans against knee, breeze singing through it. Below, river flows at each point a deep stillness. And can I get two more? Okay. The next one is called Mowing. My initial experience with mowing was in New York. We had a little lawn in the house where we grew up, and we had a push mower, and I hated mowing, because there were better things for me to be doing when I was 13 years old, right? As far as I was concerned. And then when I moved to here, my wife and I, we bought a house. We had two sort of small fields, and my original plan was I was just going to get a push gas mower, and I was going to mow these fields with that. And so the first time I mowed it, it took me 13 hours. So I said, well, I'm going to have to break, that rule. I'm going to get a mower, And so I got a mower, and I drive around, cut these places, and some of them were very tricky. And so this one's called Mowing. I know the time for first mowing. I've learned the subtle swale, how different grasses respond to the blades, how low to duck beneath the oak to save my scalp, how to balance my weight to cut side hill, how to brake to descend the steep slope. Every year, something new. An unfamiliar grass, a volunteer oak emerging from a blackberry tangle. Or what is new are small places my dog is first defined as she grows old, the warm in early spring, the cool in summer. And as I watch, the hawks, the crows, the jays, the flicker, who comes the last 2 days to feast on ants in the rotting wood bounding the garden beds, my body becomes one more changing constant in this place I call home. And this last poem is a more recent poem. It was just published in, if I can separate these two papers. There we go.
I was going to say Ricky Finger.
Yeah. So this is, again, sort of an encounter between myself and another or other beings in this world, and it's called Crow Poem. 5 crows unfold and float from dripping cottonwoods along the roiling creek to a yard across the street to share scattered stale crusts cut from a week's loads of daily bread, a common meal between good neighbors. A week before, I stopped the car for a fledgling crow in the middle of a downtown street. 5 or 6 adults urgently cawing from some overhanging branches. I couldn't move. The young crow in front, a line of traffic behind. I opened the door, slowly approached it, whispering, "It's okay, I won't hurt you." A sharp cry exploded by my ear, a sudden sting to the back of my skull, bent my head toward the pavement. Hands up, I hurried back to the car. The young crow still in the street. A man leaving a nearby shop suddenly was in the road, bending down, and quicker than my warning, his face turned from solace to pain, his hands pressed against his head. He ran back inside. 2 adults landed to guide the young crow to safety. I started the car, one hand on the wheel, the other gingerly touching the back of my head. Blood and crow spit on my fingertip. I licked it off. A good mix for a wild communion between crow and human. Thank you.